The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Watson. I am going to be your presenter today. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let some other people join in, so we'll probably start about 10:02, 10:03. All right, why don't we get everything started here now that it's about 10:03. Um, Hello, everyone. So I'll give a little quick introduction before we start. My name is Michael Watson. I'm a solutions architect at Apollo. And my role is really working with all of our customers and groups, teams, organizations on their GraphQL projects and broader adoption. Before I begin, can anyone maybe just in the chat window just confirm that you can hear me? I'm coming through loud and clear. Just before we get beginning into everything, just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. So can anyone hear me inside of that? Maybe just within the GoToWebinar chat, just confirm that. All right. So let's begin. So today's webinar is about the do's and don'ts for your schema and your operations. And one thing that I think is really funny about this title, when I first kind of wrote it out, there was a lot of internal discussion of, what exactly should be the spelling of this? Should there be apostrophes within the do's and the don'ts? There was actually just a whole Slack conversation about it. So I thought it was pretty funny. English with apostrophes, I guess, is something that I always like to try and get right, but with this kind of just do's and don'ts, didn't know. But for today, let's just call it the best practices for the schema and the operations. But as I said, I'm a solutions architect. If you want to connect with me, my GitHub handle, my Twitter handle's on there. Feel free to reach out with any questions or anything. I'm always here to help and answer. But why do we really need to care about our schema and our operations. As I'm going through this, there's a lot of questions you might have when we're thinking about your specific schema, your specific operations. Um, it's really important to us that we care about, one, our schema, because that's how our product is really going to be delivered to our client developers. What is that product experience that we want to deliver? And we want to care about how we're dealing with our operations, because if we don't do anything, things can kind of turn to the Wild West pretty fast. So if at any point you have any questions about maybe your situation, or maybe just, in general or deeper, please just drop them inside of the webinar. And at the end, I'm going to go through questions and kind of answer questions, and we'll open it up from there. Now, one thing that I think is really important is, when I start talking with all these different teams or different organizations over the past year and a half, I've reviewed hundreds of different schemas and seen, lots of different projects. And the one thing that's very common is there's typically one person or one team that kind of starts out with this GraphQL initiative and really kind of takes that first stab at it and puts it into the organization. And they kind of become the champions of GraphQL. And really, they become the champions of the data graph, because more teams start contributing to it and it starts to grow and have this network effect. But there's kind of that tip of the spearhead, right? So one of the things I always tell teams is your schema and your operations is one place and a really good opportunity for everyone to be a data graph champion. And that really just is you being the person to kind of take charge and help set some standards out there that's going to make the graph better for everyone. Now, when we kind of get into it, let's talk about our schema and really thinking about what are some of the best practices of when we're designing out our schema and just working with our schema. This is a common question I get from teams, like, how should we design our schema? One of the first things I always like to think of is actually having a user entry point for your authenticated users, right? These are the things I can actually start to do as an authenticated logged in user, whether that's query into things or whether that's, how I'm able to actually use mutations to interact with that product I'm really working with. And we also want to make sure that we're going to evolve the graph based off our client needs. A lot of times I have teams ask me, coming from REST or something else, we don't have any GraphQL. Where do we start? How do we design our schema? You don't want to just take all of your REST endpoints and the shape of them and just kind of jam that into your GraphQL schema. You really want to have that graph based off what are those client use cases, those specific product experiences that you're trying to drive on your graph. You also want to make sure that the schema you're providing for your clients is very friendly and easy to consume, right? One of the big benefits of GraphQL is the declarative nature of just being able to say, this is the data that I want. But you don't want the client then manipulating that data. You should be putting things like filtering criteria inside of input variables into your graph. And that should be driving and providing the clients exactly what they need as far as data. And as a best practice, we always want to turn off introspection in production. We want to have some centralized place that we can have everything in the organization point to and use for that. And I'll kind of talk through some things I've seen in industry and what I see other teams do to solve that. But let's kind of drill into each one of these a little bit more. So starting out with that, authenticated user and that entry point, right? You want to make sure that when our users are able to get information from our graph, that they're not providing really that user information. We should be generating that identity from the centralized authorization strategy that's coming in through that client. A lot of teams will have some like JWT or a cookie that's coming over from the client to the server. And then that's typically sent out to a centralized authentication service that's getting all of the claims and identity of that user, and then using that in the downstream services. All right. And when we have this single user entry point, you can start to see like this is what I can do with this product as like I'm logged in with my experience, because that's really going to be the same across your iOS app, your Android app, your mobile app. That might be web. You might just have a website. There's a lot of different options here, but really, even inside of all of those different channels, you're going to really have that same product experience that you're trying to drive, and it's just going to be maybe displayed differently on those different clients. Now, we said we don't want to prematurely add things to our schema. We were talking about how we want to have that driven with our client use cases, right? So when you kind of think about that, so recently at Apollo, we introduced Apollo organizations, and you have the ability to invite people into the actual organizations. And inside of the organizations, the invite members feature was something we had to add into our graph as far as mutations, right? So this was something that we added specifically in as we added that feature. And there will be more stuff that we'll need to add and change over time. But the idea is, as you have those client use cases, those product needs popping up, that's really how we should be evolving our graph, right? And being very fluid and dynamic with those changes. Awesome. Now, one of the things is, we don't really want to have introspection on in production. Now, I'm saying that in a general term. Obviously, if you have maybe like a public-facing API, the GitHub API is a great example where they provide like a nice graphical experience inside their documentation. You need to have introspection on for something like that, and that's okay. But when you only have internal clients consuming that, or maybe it's only your public-facing application, you may not want to have introspection on in production. And really, we want to have some central repository that we're having all of our, client development teams pointing at. We're having kind of the rest of our world, might be marketing, might be product development, or a product manager that needs to look at this. So having a centralized schema repository. I've seen teams do lots of different options where, maybe if it's requests coming from their internal IP address, they will serve out like a GraphQL playground or a graphical type experience. The thing with that is as you start to get into these more complex scenarios of, okay, we're going to only provide graphical to, this subset, or even just having, introspection off in production and then having a duplicate of production that's only available internally, you're having a lot of different things that you have to manage now. And really, you just want to have like a centralized place for that schema. Now, one of the things in Apollo, if you're using Apollo Server and you set that node environment variable to production, it'll automatically turn off introspection by default, along with GraphQL Playground. Now, we also have in the Apollo platform, we have a centralized schema registry that is available free for everyone to use. And we have a CLI, this Apollo Service Push, will actually enable you to publish a GraphQL schema into the registry. Now, this is kind of like, I think of almost like a Git repository for my schema, but it also can have, various different environments. So you see this tag, that tag could be used for staging, production, that's really how you would manage your schemas across different environments. And this gives you now a central place for everyone in the organization to start pointing at that. So we actually have a Explorer that's on Apollo Graph Manager. This would be something that you could provide to marketing or other teams within the organization that might want to look at that schema and see it at different stages. And maybe like something coming through a QA or a beta group. And then for our developers, we also have integrations. So we also have our Visual Studio Code Apollo extension. And this does nice things like providing IntelliSense for your schema. And if you also send traces over to Graph Manager, we'll start publishing timing data. So you can see that 16 milliseconds. So if there's valid traces against that query, we'll actually be able to populate the timing data in there for your developers as they add fields or change their queries, mutations in their code. So some nice tooling and everything that goes around hooking up to that central schema registry, and that's all available on the community edition, free for everyone. Now, we also talked about making sure the client experience, what they're getting as far as that data, they don't really have to manipulate that much. We don't want them doing extra work. And so, like, here's something we've all made before, right? Some filtering criteria for our website, right? So this is actually what it looks like in Apollo Graph Manager. You see we have some time range stuff. You can filter by different client applications. There's kind of like a search bar experience. There's a lot of different things you can see inside of there. But that really is stuff that should be used as filtering variables for our graph. So as our users are selecting different information inside of here, that's actually just changing what our queries are and actually just changing what the data that's being displayed in. So this is a really nice pattern too when you start using it with something like React hooks. So definitely something that I would recommend putting on your graph and making that client development experience really getting the full benefits of GraphQL by just having exactly what they need delivered. I always think of one of the most common things I came across when I first started with GraphQL was around latitude, longitude coordinates. Typically inside of your client applications, you're never actually displaying latitude, longitude, but you need the latitude, longitude for maybe the Google Maps SDK, or maybe you just want to create a Google Maps URL that has the latitude, longitude, so someone can click on it and goes to Google Maps. Even doing something as simple as that, you would want to actually provide a Google Maps URL to your client developers versus having the latitude, longitude, and them constructing the URL themselves in their client application. Simply because if every client app is doing that, then now you have 3 teams that have created, 3 sets of code that's going to be more technical debt over time, right? So we want to have that filtering options available on our graph. Now, just to kind of sum up the schema best practices we talked about having, a single entry point for authenticated users. These are the things I can do with inside this graph as a logged in authenticated user. We want to involve that graph based on the needs of our client teams and really what our product experience is. I always try and think of, bullet point number 2 really as my product. Because I have a lot of teams say like, well, are we now just creating a new thing on our graph every time a client team asks for something? Maybe, but when you really distill it down to what do I want to do with inside my product, that's going to cover a lot more of your client consumers' use cases. They'll just be asking for slightly different data inside of there. We also want to make sure that that schema we're providing doesn't cause our clients to really have to manipulate the data that's being returned to them. And we can solve that by putting filtering options and really having a tight collaboration with our client consumers on how they want that. One example I always like to bring up over at Expedia Group, they actually like to give a blank piece of paper to client teams for changes or modifications to the graph. And they want them to design out what would be the ideal query shape or mutation that you're trying to do. And let's see what it would take to implement that or what it would be from there. So it really gives that client product focus on that. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're turning off introspection in production and we're using some centralized schema for all of our GraphQL tooling. And, of course, for public partner API usage, that would definitely be a use case where we would leave that on. Now that we've kind of covered everything as far as some best practices inside of our schema, let's switch over to our operations, right? And, I have a lot of teams, this is probably, operations are the thing that gets forgotten about in your GraphQL development. We talked about how there was that first team or that first person that's kind of the tip of the spearhead. They just start seeing so many cool things and benefits they get from GraphQL. They really just get into it, and it starts expanding, and everyone gets excited. And no one really thinks about what are maybe some standards we should put for operations. They may put in standards for testing and schema and everything else, but operations kind of is the thing that gets circled back to, I usually see. So we really should care about this because our observability stack becomes a little bit more difficult to see things if we kind of let nothing be a standard for operations and let the Wild West happen. And we'll kind of talk about and show what are some situations where that could kind of make things muddy. And this is really our opportunity. I would say every single person on this webinar, operations is your opportunity to go back to your team and say, hey, here's some simple things we can change, and we're going to be able to start seeing more at our graph. We're going to start being able to understand how our product experience is being driven on our graph and a lot more. So let's dive into that. So the first thing is, a lot of teams don't create any standard. You need to create some standard as far as what is naming your operations. And this could be super simple. Like I challenge every team, just write some things on a piece of like a quip, a Google Doc, a Word doc, whatever doc you use. Write down a few of these things, share it with the team, and you just become like the champion for operations and what that standard should be in your organization, right? And I've seen so many teams have nothing here that I'm pretty confident a lot of people would be able just to kind of throw something out there and then start iterating on that quickly. You also want to make sure you're validating your GraphQL operations before you're shipping anything. So you might have some tests that you've written that kind of give you some coverage here. But really what we should be doing is we should be doing a static analysis of the shape of our GraphQL operations from our client teams and comparing that with the shape of the schema that's being served at our production GraphQL endpoint, right? And that's just making sure that these are going to be valid against those, right? And this ideally should be done in our CI/CD pipelines. And another thing we want to do is we want to attach a client name and version to every trace operation for our observability stack. So when you think about your graph, it may have started out with just one client team, but all of a sudden the mobile team jumps in. And then the mobile team has lots of different versions they have to support. You're going to want to see how those operations grow and change and morph over time with those different GraphQL versions, or those different client versions. And you're going to want to see the performance differences between those, right? We added these new fields into this operation. What was the performance? You're going to want to see the granularity between those two client versions. And that's why you want to have that operations evolve with that client version number. You're going to want to see that performance change. When if you didn't actually understand that the operation shape changed from version 1 to version 2, and you see a drastic performance change, you're going to want to be able to see that and correlate those items in your observability stack. So you're going to want to have your operations really evolve with that client version. I've seen some teams potentially like actually changing the operation name as like, oh, V1, V2, V3. Don't necessarily think about it as your operation changing as V1, V2, V3. It's really that client version that's changing. Let's dive into these a little bit deeper. So don't do nothing for your operations, right? And this is kind of a strange thing to think about, don't do nothing, because you're probably doing something. But when I say don't do nothing, like don't do nothing as far as a standard within the organization, right? And this is what's going to end up happening over time. You're going to start to see some operations won't be named. Some operations will be named. Some will have, a UI thing affixed in front of it. Teams are going to start making their own standards, which makes sense to them. But what happens if someone moves from one team to the next, right? You want to start making it where how I get data within the organization is the same across everything. All right. So we want to name our operations and we want to create a standard internally. So internally at Apollo, we have our Apollo CLI, we have our dashboard Apollo Graph Manager, and then we have a bunch of other things as far as internal services and stuff that consume our graph. So we affix UI, or we prefix UI in front of any operations that come from our web UI. And then we will, anything else from our CLI or anything else won't have that UI fixed in front of it. So this is a really simple standard that we have internally. And I would highly recommend that you throw something out there that really makes sense for your team and your organization and your graph. Now, you don't want to go blind into production with your operations, right? You probably have some tests and everything, but you really want to have a way to extract out the operations from your client bundle and validate them, right? And that should really be validated against whatever your centralized schema repository is. Because if we have production or introspection off in production, you can't have your CI job like introspect your endpoint and then take that and then validate it with all your operations. So if you're using that centralized schema registry I mentioned, there is also a feature called Apollo Client Check, which will actually extract out all of the operations from that client bundle. This will work for both JavaScript, TypeScript projects or native mobile projects. And then that will validate that against whatever is in that centralized schema registry. And you can also switch between different environments. So if you want to validate against a staging schema or whatever, that's also available there for you. And one other piece, if you're using like TypeScript or maybe Swift, you can actually use the Apollo CLI to actually code gen out all of your types. So this is actually a really nice feature. There's also a watch feature in here that a lot of TypeScript React developers will use to actually auto-generate out their types. And it's all connected to that centralized schema registry. Now I mentioned we don't want to lose the visibility of how our clients are consuming our team, because like for example in here we're deprecating this service IDs, but when can I delete service IDs from my graph? Like I have some teams that I've seen where they deprecate things but they never actually delete it from their graph. It's just kind of like there's a huge deprecation section and they just kind of like copy and paste it to a section of the query or mutation, and there's a bunch of a block of deprecations. So we don't want to, or we want to understand how our clients are consuming our graph so we know when we can delete this deprecated fields, right? And this is why we want to attach our client name and version to every trace operation. Now, if you're using Apollo Client, we actually we have a name and version in the constructor. And for every name and version, that will be translated to two known header values. So these are two header values that you could use in your observability stack further down the line. And if you're using Apollo Server, we actually automatically attach that client name and client version to every trace operation. So those are two kind of things. And Apollo Server does that by looking for those two known header values. So if you're not using Apollo Client, but you are using Apollo Server, you could just add those two header values to whatever your GraphQL request is, and Apollo Server will automatically pull that into your trace. Now, just to pull them all back up and kind of review the operations best practices, we want to create a simple standard for naming our operations. And this can be something very, very simple. I mean, even what we do internally with just putting UI in front of the operations for things that are coming from the UI, you could take that, start that out with your team. And I'm sure some other members of your organization might add in a few other pieces that kind of make that better. We also want to attach client name and version to every operation trace. It's really important for your observability stack and helping us understand, how our operations evolve with each client version. And I skipped over two, but we want to validate those GraphQL operations before we're really shipping anything out into production, right? Are my client's queries going to work when I push this into production? And we should have some static analysis that's able to be done in our CI job. Sorry, screen just flicked. Now, we do want to evolve those operations, right? We talked about how we want to have our operations evolve over time. And here's a great example. So inside of our Apollo CLI, you can actually see where our schema or our mutation has grown from our version 2.18 and our version 2.20. Now you can kind of see that this change in the shape of that operation grew a lot, right? So there's probably going to be a performance impact that's here, and we want to be able to see in our observability stack the difference of performance between those two operations. Now, just to kind of review everything, I think in the schema best practices and operations best practices that we reviewed today, there's definitely at least one of these things that you could take back to your team and start working on and implementing today. Whether it's, going through and kind of what is this entry point for our users? I think that's one common thing that some teams like to start adding inside of there. Or starting to add in some of that filtering criteria inside of your graph. If you're a client team and you're manipulating any data inside of the what's being returned from your graph, go back to the team that owns that schema or that GraphQL server, or try to influence in that and say, hey, look at all this code we have to do on the client side. That's going to be magnified when you start having an iOS app, an Android app, or more clients consuming that. And if you have introspection on production, one of the quick, easy things you could do is actually switching over and using some centralized schema repository, right? Getting the team into a place where you have really a central place for everyone in the organization to look at. And you're not kind of showing everything in your schema to the whole world as you may be changing it or adding new features over time. All right, and you could easily just use the Apollo Graph Manager along with the Apollo CLI to hook that all up and show that to the team as well. And if you think about the operations, whether that's just creating that simple, naming standard, you can even just have the UI portion, or whether that's actually validating your GraphQL operations from that static central schema registry. Those are two things that I see a lot of teams actually being able to implement really quick. Writing out a bunch of tests for every operation and writing a new test for every client operation you create can become cumbersome. So having a way to do static analysis is a very quick win from your team. And then making sure you can really understand how your operations are changing and growing from your client's name and version over time. So I challenge everyone to take at least one of these things, go back to your team and really help be a champion of your graph. Now, I want to take a moment to switch over and jump into some questions. I normally have someone here with me to help answer some questions, and we had an unfortunate last-minute change. So let me pull over my window and see some questions that have popped up inside of here. Sorry, my window keeps switching over. Oh no, it looks like some people have not been able to see my slides. Oh no. And I see a they're better now at one point. Oh man. Well, I wish I would have seen this beforehand. Let's see if I can make a quick change. All right, I'm gonna just open up the mic for everyone since there was some issues with the slides and viewing, and let's maybe see if we can figure this out. Wait, how do I do this? Uh, Mark says it's okay now, but wasn't earlier. Well, I'm going to make sure the team, or well, everyone that was on here is going to be able to get my slides. Um, I am happy to answer any questions about anything that I talked to. What we're planning on going to be offering this again in another month, and we'll make sure that we have things fixed on that, or whatever went wrong here. I'll make sure we figure that out. Are there any questions about the do's and don'ts, or maybe is there anything we want to maybe revisit, or are there any slides that maybe Mark or anyone in the Slack that wants to go through? All right. Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to be hanging around for the next 15 minutes and stuff. If anyone wants to ask any questions at all, I'm going to just hang around to answer any questions. It could be about this. It could just be about GraphQL. It could be about anything. I'm an open book. And I also want to provide everyone my contact information. So my email address is watson@apollographql.com. If you ever have any questions about your project, about what you're doing, or anything, maybe how do we get started or anything, feel free to reach out, send me an email. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And if you don't have any other questions or anything else, I hope you found some value out of this, and have a happy holidays, and I hope you get to spend some time with your family. All right, so Corey's got a question. What's the most common pitfall when starting to use graphs? Most common pitfall. I don't know if I can point to one specifically, but let me talk about maybe like one or two that I do see that are pretty common. I think one of the most common ones is when you're starting with the graph, like who actually owns the graph. So I've worked with some teams where like the server team or the backend services, whoever owns the infrastructure, they kind of start and try to do GraphQL. It might be an initiative where we've heard from a bunch of client teams internally, they're asking for GraphQL. We normally just provide REST endpoints, so now we're going to start doing a GraphQL endpoint. And so they start to really develop out a graph that doesn't have as much input from the client teams. And so they end up creating a graph that is kind of resty. It looks like a REST graph, right? You look at the mutation, it has a lot of CRUD operations inside of it. That's something that uh, other client teams, they don't like. And that's where I mentioned making sure your graph is providing data that your client teams don't have to manipulate. And that's really where you're now having a schema that's really what the clients want. Kind of why the Expedia group starts out with giving the client team a blank sheet of paper. Because one of the things I've seen, a server team goes, they spin up GraphQL, they put it out there, and then no client teams consume it. And part of it is because you have a bunch of members on the teams. Like each one of those teams, I mentioned there's maybe a GraphQL champion, but there's also the other half of the team that likes the REST world and they want to stay there. Maybe they use Redux, they like it, they want that. And when they look at the graph, they say, well, how is that any different than REST? It's kind of the same thing. And they're kind of right at sometimes, just because the way the graph was designed. I think it's really important when you're designing that graph out that the client team is really involved. So like I've actually had some engagements with other teams where I pushed back and I said, hey, look, we really can't help you until we have a client use case that we're going to develop this graph against. Because if you do just develop a graph without a client team on board or anything, you're going to just develop some technical debt that isn't going to work. And then it's going to be even harder to bring GraphQL into that organization because there was already one failed project. So I think that's really one common path I see is like when the server team owns it, and there's not like this client ownership that kind of brings it to life. Now, another common pitfall that I see when teams are kind of starting out with their graph is trying to take on everything at once. I had one company and a lead architect come to me and say, like, we want to start with GraphQL, but I have 800 REST APIs. How do I do this? You have to find a place to start with the client teams. And as you start to build out whatever your MVP, your POC, your starting project is, you really, really need to make sure that you're not trying to solve every single checkbox for the enterprise from day zero, right? There's going to be things you're going to have to figure out and upgrade and do over time. But if you just like throw authentication, throw your security, throw your caching, and all this stuff at your GraphQL while you're also trying to design your schema, it's just going to be very challenging. It's a lot, right? So, start out with that client use case, get a quick schema together, get that interacting with your real data sources, and then that's your MVP that you start showing people. Then you start adding in your auth layer, add in your security, add in your caching. And when you add in your caching, do that in line with whatever your performance issues are, right? Don't just put caching like blanket across your entire graph. Find the areas where you need caching, where it's going to make that product experience better. I had one team where they're like, yeah, we had caching everywhere, but in these like 4 areas, it added like a 10 millisecond performance bump, where in other areas it cut like seconds off. That's where you really want to focus your time on, the seconds, not the little pieces. All right, I got another question from Mark. Do you ever see bottleneck performance while having a single endpoint versus REST where having multiple, and you're using AWS Lambda right now? Yeah, so I think there's 2 pieces inside of that. One, there's the serverless aspect, right? So if you have, let's say, AWS Lambdas as far as like your data sources underneath your graph, you kind of have a request coming in, it's hitting your first Lambda, which is your GraphQL server, then it's hitting like downstream Lambdas for whatever the downstream sources are. And that's where, depending on your cold starts and how your infrastructure is there, you could have some performance things for a few specific users. But I will say, I do know some very, very large digital media companies, top 5 websites that you visit that use AWS Lambda with GraphQL in the exact setup we just described. The GraphQL server is a Lambda handler. That goes down to other Lambda handlers as far as the data sources, which connects to a bunch of stuff. As far as like performance, I didn't hear huge things in there. There's definitely talks from them about using CDN in their caching. Obviously, news media sites have a lot of cacheability in articles and things like that, and they use CDNs very heavily. So there's a high caching rate. So, there might be some issues with other stuff. I do know of other companies, though, that have tried out serverless types of infrastructures, and their request volume is so high that the pricing doesn't really work out for them. And so they actually start using more traditional hosting. That was from a very tiny startup that has a very high caching rate. They use a lot of CDN stuff. They had about 10 billion requests per week at their GraphQL server. So there's a lot of differences, but I wouldn't say I've seen any huge bottlenecks in performance. But each one of those AWS Lambda, I've seen, very a lot of caching involved in there, whether that's CDN or even caching at the GraphQL server. Now, I think the single endpoint versus versus a bunch of REST endpoints is kind of what we're talking about as the next thing. So as far as bottleneck performance, depending on how you have your graph set up. So let's say you have like a REST infrastructure right now, and then you're going to layer GraphQL over that. When you really start thinking about it, what you're really doing is you're taking the multiple requests that you're making on the client side of things and you're moving that to the server. So sometimes you actually get a performance enhancement just from having the client making one request and then having the server making the multiple requests. This is also why the BFF pattern, back end for front end, became so popular. Teams were making a back end that grouped all the responses together that the client would have needed to make to create that screen, and they get a little performance enhancement from that. So I don't think that's specific to GraphQL. That's more of that having a majority of those requests be on the server and kind of having the client only request like one thing per page or whatever they need. But one of the things GraphQL also provides is the ability to add different caching layers in between your data sources and your server. So for example, inside of Apollo Server, we have our REST data source interface. There's been a lot of thought that's been built into that in the cache. But when you start layering your GraphQL server over your REST data sources, you may want to start caching your REST data sources. So you may be a client team that's actually trying to bring GraphQL in because it takes too long to get certain things from your services team. Well, if that's the case, you have the opportunity to also start adding a caching layer in at that GraphQL server, because for your use cases, you might want to add different caching options. So for example, I mentioned those one of those media companies I was talking about. There's another one that I was working with, and one of their requirements internally was when a editor makes a change to an article on the website, that needs to be live within 30 seconds across their entire infrastructure. Well, that's great to know because now we can have a 30-second time to live for everything across all their REST services, right? That's a REST caching layer. Thinking of how browsers work and applications work when someone reloads the page or does things like this, this is where caching versus batching, like data loader batching, this is where caching now starts to give you a lot of performance benefits within your GraphQL server. So it's not a black and white, you're going to get better performance, you're going to get worse performance. I think, typically when the first thing gets put out there, the performance is around on par with REST, and that there's work that happens to make things better. Or sometimes I've seen teams go from REST and then put this GraphQL layer in, and things get way better, way faster, just because they were doing so much stuff on the client side of things. So I think the performance aspect also plays to where's your company in its journey as far as client application development. If you have like an old school like ASP.NET on like .NET 4 framework, that you're going to get, if you put GraphQL in, you're going to get a ton of performance enhancements across the board for everything. I'm assuming you're probably also using SOAP in a lot of places. And even if you just went to REST, you'd get a lot of performance enhancements. You may be coming from a greenfield project where you have the choice. And that's where I see a lot of teams, for example, I can't say the name, but I know, one very big organization that's has a lot of really great engineering things coming out of it. They have standardized as now going forward, everything will be GraphQL and gRPC for the data sources underneath. So kind of depends on where you're at. I hope that, kind of long-winded answer helped you out there, Mark. All right. I'm just looking through to see if there is any other questions. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank everyone for taking the time with me. I'm going to have the recording of this. I'm going to check to see if maybe the slide issue thing happened there. If it did, what I'll do is I will quickly just re-record the beginning portion of this, splice that into the recording, and I'll send that out to everyone just so you can see all the slides through everything. and then I'll just put the talk track to those slides. Awesome. Oh, great, Mark. GraphQL over a couple of data sources. Yeah, yeah. I would say, you know, one of the big benefits there too, especially if your data sources are owned by third-party services, um, check into the REST data source in Apollo server and how that caching mechanism works. That will be very helpful. I actually implemented a graph layer for our Salesforce, our like CRM data. And I just use their SDK and their REST interface. And I use our REST data source so I can do my own caching because I know like we have cron jobs that do things like per day. So I can add in like other different caching things. Now I only have like 10 users, but different different use case. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Happy holidays, and like I said, I hope you get to spend some time with your family and um, enjoy everything. And we'll see you in the new year.